and the rest of it is details. Because if we can't keep this war bottled up in Ukraine, if it does come west, we start losing cities. And unfortunately, if the Ukrainians win, the only way that they can stop the Russians from trying again is to cross the border into Russia proper and take out a couple logistical hubs that unfortunately are also major cities, places like Belgorod and Rostov-on-Don. And that would probably prompt the Russians to use nukes in a defensive manner. So I know this sounds horrible, but a stalemate in Ukraine is probably the best case scenario for everyone except the Ukrainians. Anything short of winning is absolutely intolerable, but if they're going to use nukes in Ukraine, that really doesn't help them very much.
No, but why wouldn't the Russians use or threaten to use nukes on anyone supplying weapons to Ukraine at this point?
They did that in the first couple of months of the war, and two things happened. The Ukrainians proved that they could fight very well with very limited support from the West, at least temporarily. So there was a while when they were thinking about nuking Warsaw specifically, because that's where most of the weapons were funneled through. But when more and more countries signed online and when more and more supply routes to the Ukrainians opened up, that lost a lot of its justification. It was made very clear to Putin personally that we have real-time intelligence on his personal location at any given time. And so we made it very clear to him that if nukes were used on any NATO territory anywhere in the world, that the first nuke that would go back would be targeting him personally. And that focused a few minds in the Kremlin. That only works so long as we're locked up in Ukraine. If Ukraine falls, then it's a broader scale. And if Ukraine succeeds and all of a sudden the Russian border is the one that's under threat, then we're in a very different defensive strategic environment. At the moment, keeping the nukes off the table means keeping the war within Ukraine's borders, more or less.
Why is Putin suicidal under certain of these scenarios? Any significant use of nukes is obviously suicide.
The Russian demographic situation has decayed to such a point that without a more secure outer perimeter, they probably will be gone as a functional country before 2040. When that is your understanding of your own country, the strictness of the systems of mutually assured destruction and a degree of trust, ironically, that we had during the Soviet period is gone. The Russians feel that if they can't pull this off all the way to the Danube, to the Vistula, that they're doomed anyway. And so if they need nukes to get something that conventionally they can't get, they are fully willing to do that. Now, I would guess that what would happen in this specific scenario, and everyone's scenarios here are a little loosey-goosey because this war has evolved in so many directions that nobody anticipated. So take this for what it is, it's just a guess. If Ukraine falls and the Russian military reaches the border with Poland and Romania and the Balts, the Putin government would have a conference call with Germany or with Berlin and London and Stockholm and Washington. No, we probably wouldn't bring in Washington and in Paris and say, hey, look, we've already programmed the nukes. They're going to launch tomorrow at noon unless you repudiate your alliance with those 5 states and immediately and publicly begin your withdrawal of forces from all 5 of them. If you do that, we won't launch. And they'll try to break NATO one last time. That's what I would do if I was Putin.
And what do you think NATO should do under those conditions? I mean, we have
NATO does not want to have to make that decision. That's why we're backing Ukraine.
And on that front, do you think we should be backing Ukraine much more energetically than we are?
I think it's possible. There's 2 problems here, though. Number one, the baby bus that hit the rest of the world hit Ukraine actually harder than most. So they only have so many troops. And they now have had so many troops so engaged for so long, it's difficult for them to rustle up more troops to get trained on more advanced equipment. The next phase of training for the Ukrainians is going to be much more difficult than what's happened to this point, just because of the numbers. So it's not clear to me, and I know all of my friends in the military are stressing about this too, about what can be done to move things forward, even if the politics in the United States were perfect, of which they are not. The second problem is a little bit broader on the European front. The Europeans spent 30 years preparing for a world where there would never be a war again. Mm-hmm. And after 2 years of giving the Ukrainians almost every weapon system they can think of, the cupboard's starting to get a little thin. So it's not clear to me what the next phase of the war is going to look like. Yes, the Russians have been exhausted. Yes, the Russians have lost all their pre-war military, tanks, men, everything. But they have a Soviet stockpile to draw upon and another probably 6 million men in their 20s that they can draft. the West is going to have to figure out something else. Because even if the block on the aid in Congress goes away tomorrow, the Europeans are nearly spent. They've sent everything they can. And the United States is now starting to run out of the backlog of decommissioned military equipment that has been the bulk of our donations. About 80% by value, 70, 88% by value of what we've sent is stuff that we don't use anymore. We have not really delved into our active equipment. And if we're going to continue support past this calendar year, we're either going to have to start making a lot of stuff that we haven't made in 30 years, or we're going to have to start training the Ukrainians on our top line equipment, which requires an order of magnitude more effort and supply and logistical tail. Whatever we go with requires a lot of military industrial expansion on the production side, and you don't do that overnight. So we're facing a number of crimp points in our support for Ukraine that is making this very uncomfortable.
But it also sounds like too much support would be a bad thing. It would tip us over into a nearer-term existential threat from the Russian point of view.
Absolutely a concern. I think that has become less of a concern over the last 16 months. The fact that the counteroffensives last year from the Ukrainians did not amount to any significant breakthroughs, this is going to sound horrible, gives the United States a little bit of confidence that that scenario, the Russians fighting a nuclear war defensively, is a little further off. There's nothing about this that is pretty for anyone.
All right. So how much land do you have in New Zealand, and what are your favorite MRE brands?
I actually have a New Zealand degree, and my job is portable, so I can qualify for citizenship in a day if I decide that I want to. And Peak Refuel is my go-to. Thank God for the preppers. They put a lot of money into that freeze-dried stuff. It actually tastes pretty good now.
Okay, China. What's happening over there, and why shouldn't we all be investing in the Chinese stock market at this point?
Well, you do with your money what you want to. Let's see. When we spoke last, it was about 8 months ago. Does that sound right?
Sounds about right.
Yeah. Okay. So at that point, it was literally a week before the new demographic data came out. And so at the time that you and I were speaking with Ian Bremmer, China was already the fastest aging society in the world and had the third or fourth fastest aging workforce ever recorded of any time. And they were on path to seeing their workforce cease to exist as a functional unit within a decade. Less than a week later, the data was updated, and they were then reporting that their their number of fresh births year on year had dropped by more as a percentage of their population than what had happened to the Jews of Europe during the Holocaust since 2017, which, there's no historical analog for that at all. And in the last month, they've updated the data again to indicate that they may have still overcounted the number of births that they've had in the last 5 years, because the number of kids that are enrolling in kindergarten is sharply lower than what they were expecting just 12 months ago. So we are seeing a country that is not in demographic decay, but is in the advanced stages of irreversible demographic collapse. And they are now literally running out of people in their late 40s already. And this is not even the worst case scenario. That is, what's his name? Yu Fishuan, I believe. I'm probably mispronounced that. Apologies. But he's a Chinese demographer who thinks that the overcount in the Chinese population is probably about 250 million people. We are looking at nothing short of a civilizational collapse over the course of the next 15 years. I would not invest in the stock market.
And how would you expect them to behave in the meanwhile? If it was CCP on down.
Yeah, if I was going to use air quotes and a normal country, there might be any number of policy prescriptions that you could try to at least buy some more time or deflect this a little bit. But Chairman Xi has so inoculated the system. He's purged so thoroughly that there's no one left. Decision-making capacity within the government has almost fallen to zero. He's established himself as the sole decision maker, but he's also penalized the transfer of information. So the bureaucracy has responded to this by not even collecting data anymore, much less transmitting it. And so we're seeing policy collapses across the length and the breadth of the entire system that is really confusing the business community because they're not used to seeing this. At the same time, that you get a crackdown on the business community for being the only part of the system where there's some thought and planning going on. This is not the recipe for something that's going to last a decade. The Chinese are almost itching, it seems, to find their way to state failure as quickly as possible. I don't mean that they're doing that on purpose, but I mean they're sabotaging their own government in honor of the cult of personality.
It seems that much of the foreign policy establishment has not gotten this particular memo, and I still hear China routinely described as the other superpower, the emerging one, and the question is whether we're going to fall into some Thucydides trap with them.
Sure.
Graham Allison wrote a book by that title.
Now, in defense of Graham, real quick, he did point out that only happens half the times. The Thucydides trap is not something that happens every time there's a transfer of power or a rise of a new power. It happens about half the time. In addition, the Chinese rise was largely because of the American-led globalized order. And they are actually more dependent upon that now than they were before. So if there were a war, the Chinese would not just lose it, they would lose it so thoroughly, they would have a deindustrialization collapse complete with a famine in a very short period of time.
So what are you expecting with them to do with respect to Taiwan?
That's an open question. If the Russians succeed with what they want to do in Ukraine and Poland and Romania and the rest, they actually do buy themselves a lot of time. They get in a much better strategic position, and they will probably persist till the very end of this century. I think that's a realistic possibility.
How do they buy themselves time demographically? I mean, don't they suffer the same demographic collapse or by absorbing those countries?
The demographic situation is still problematic. Don't mean to suggest it's going to get better. But by being able to plug their military access points, they can focus most of the manpower that they have remaining on maintaining civil control. And if there's one thing the Russians know how to do, it's how to put down a protest. If they don't have to worry about the exterior power, they can worry about the interior elements. And they are, unfortunately, quite good at that. China doesn't have something like that. There's no place that China can go. There's no land they can occupy. There's no resource that they can secure that heads off their problems. They are the world's largest importer of almost every raw commodity, foods included. They import 80% of the stuff they need to grow their own food, and they're the world's largest food importer. They need a globalized system, healthy, vibrant, functional, and made safe by someone else. If they launch a war, they lose access to all of that overnight. So a war, even in Taiwan, that conquers the entire place without a shot, conquers Tokyo without a shot, Manila, Jakarta, all of it. Take the entire first island chain. Everyone just accedes. It's still not enough. They need full access to the entire globe for both consumption and production. And that's not going to be in the cards ever. So if you're betting on famine in China. You mean if I'm betting on famine again in China?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So you have a very different picture of America's future, although I'm not sure how sanguine it is, given the fact that we may be experiencing a nuclear winter, which will not observe any political borders.
That would suck.
Yeah. Just how rosy is your picture of life in America, given what you've said about the prospects of failing to avoid a nuclear war, which is really more or less everyone's assumption about the future?
Fair enough. Well, China, I think, is going to ultimately descend into a disintegration where it falls apart in its own juices. I think the challenge of the China disintegration is going to be largely one of replacing the industrial plant that's necessary somewhere else in the world, in North America, before we lose all the Chinese stuff. And that's a bit of a race. And I'm actually been fairly optimistic at how fast the American business community has moved. In the last 5 years, we've seen industrial construction spending more than quadruple in the United States. And in the electronic space, it's increased by a factor of 10. Now, we need more. We need more. But that's a good start. The Russian situation, assuming for the moment that we can help the Ukrainians engineer the death of the Russian military on the plains of eastern and southern Ukraine, then that problem becomes one of a second Russian disintegration. And I don't mean to suggest there won't be a lot to manage there, but that will probably, fingers crossed, keep the Russian disintegration wrapped up within the borders of today's Russian Federation as non-Russian ethnic groups rise up, as they have in the past, and attempt to control their own destinies. And the groups to follow most closely are the Tatars and the Bashkirs, who are Turkic descendant groups, kind of like the Chechens. but much more sophisticated, much more technologically commanding, and sitting on the most important infrastructure within the Russian Federation. They control the cluster of pipes and power lines and roads and rail that connect all of Siberia to European Russia. And if the Russians lose that, that takes most of the oil patrimony overnight. And I think that's the most likely outcome over the course of the next 20 years, assuming the Russians don't proceed past Ukraine. That's ultimately a part of the long-term problem that the Russians have identified as justifying the war in the first place. So they can focus on keeping those peoples down. It's not a stupid plan. It's simply a dangerous one. Assuming
given that that's what success looks like, the disintegration of Russia without starting a nuclear war with the West, the first thing I think about under those conditions is that now, Russia becomes an even scarier, by a factor of 1,000 version of North Korea, and with lots of loose nukes to worry about. And that's what avoids a nuclear war on your account. What, if anything, can anyone do about that? I mean, the prospect of loose nukes under a complete disintegration of Russia is pretty terrifying.
Well, let me point out two things. Number one, we've been here already. This basically happened in the 1990s. You had de facto independence movements in a number of the Russian republics, including in Tatarstan. And we almost got to this point. Second, the loose nukes question, unfortunately, is a series of unknowns stacked on top of a series of even more unknowns. But consider the state of the Russian military the first month of the war and how badly it did and how badly the equipment performed, even if it was in the hands of supposedly soldiers who knew what they were doing. We have no idea what the status of the Russian nuclear arsenal is. We do know that everything that the defense minister has touched has suffered. Shoigu has easily stolen 1/3 of the defense budget in Russia personally, and probably another third by his cronies. That includes the nuclear arsenal. It's entirely possible, and I think this is the Biden administration's nightmare scenario here, that the Putin government hits the red button and nothing happens. What do you do when someone attempts to nuke you and fails? Because they're going to rip apart the panel and try to hit that big red button again. What's your plan for that? But what that suggests to me is every day that passes where a nuke doesn't fly is a day where those weapons degrade a little bit more. And I'm not suggesting that we're not setting ourselves up for the next major security crisis. That's absolutely in the cards here. But spinning down an old nuke in order to re-up its punch requires facilities that exist in very few parts of the world, in really just 7 countries. So if you were to give a random dude an old nuke, it's not like he can blow up a city, probably. And I realize it's a probably on a maybe. But it's not something I spend too much time being overly stressed about, because at the moment, the strategic nukes are in the silos and controlled by a major power. And they are far more dangerous there today than they would be 15 years from now in some random dude's hands.
Okay, so back to the happy talk about America. Why is life so good in America when everything unravels everywhere else?
Okay, in a post-China, post-Germany environment, we're looking at a massive amount of industrial plant on the tune of probably $40 to $50 trillion that needs to be relocated somewhere else. Now, doing that in an environment of the retiring boomers and capital constraints is a massively inflationary operation that will also generate the fastest economic growth in the countries that are able to participate in it. So I would anticipate over the course of the next several years, let's call it a decade at tops, that we're going to roughly double the size of the industrial plant in North America, leveraging American capital and labor with Mexican consumption and labor, and with the Canadians coming in to help wherever they can. That is an amazing growth story. It's a stressful one. It will push everything we have to the limit. But, the fastest growth in history, that's nothing to sniff at. That, in my mind, is a great story. It's against a backdrop of a lot of global crap, but it gets us to a place where our supply chains are largely immune to international shocks. That's a plus.
What about the problem of U.S. debt going forward?
Okay, I'm a fiscal conservative, so I really don't like talking about this issue. But it's really hard for me when I look at it geopolitically to get too concerned. And that doesn't mean that I think that Biden or Trump or Obama or W had the capacity of crafting a meaningful economic policy. I think they all failed. But a few things to look at. First of all, let's talk about outer reaches. How far can we go before it's a problem? Japan's national debt, if you include pension arrears today, is over 500% of GDP, so 4 times ours. And they're still there, and they are not the global currency. So even in the worst case scenario, we can quadruple our debt from our current levels, and it might make for some uncomfortable thinking in a number of ways, but it wouldn't destroy the country. Second, we get a lot free. As long as we maintain our long-term growth pattern, which for the last 50 years has been about 3% a year. That means the first $850 billion of debt is kind of free because it doesn't expand the debt load as a percentage of the economy. That's a lot of wiggle room. And in a number of years of the last 20, our deficit expansion has been below that level. Third, there is no hint of any challenge to the US dollar as the global currency. And as long as that is the case, anything that we do that is debt-driven actually hurts most of the rest of the world more than everybody else and actually reduces the cost of the US dollar versus other currencies. And considering most of the other currencies are facing long-term degradation from demographic reasons, having a little degradation of our own actually makes us a little bit more competitive. Not my preferred way of getting there, but you take your good news where you can these days. The Europeans confiscated the insured bank deposits of the depositors during their financial crisis. And so everyone who could get out of the euro did. It's just a regional currency now. It's sufficient for that purpose, but it's never going to be a global competitor. The Brits removed them from the equation with Brexit, especially since they haven't figured out what's next. The Japanese tried to go global in the 80s and it blew up in their face, and they will never try that again. The Chinese yuan is not convertible, and people forget that the money supply in China is over double what it is here, despite the fact that they're not a currency of trade and they're not a currency that stores value. They've done everything to their money supply that all the gold hawks say that the Fed is doing, and they've been doing it harder and longer. So there's no competition there. And my personal favorite is BRICS, because in the opening statements in Johannesburg last year, the Chinese, Indians, and South Africans, all in their opening statements, said they had no interest in a BRICS currency at all. And they wanted just the dollar system to continue, and would people please stop asking them about it? But that doesn't match with the discussion in financial circles in the United States. So that was very underreported.
I just want to take a moment to entertain a counterfactual here.
Sure.
So you've got fairly explicit and hair-raising, in many cases, predictions. What would have to happen for them not to be true? I mean, let's just take 2 points here. You take the bearishness on Europe or on China versus the bullishness on America. Let's just say that the opposite is the case.
Sure.
Europe thrives, China thrives, and America stagnates. What is the scenario that could make such a thing happen, which is to say falsify those 2 core predictions?
There's 2 moving parts which are difficult to predict that in theory could deflect my forecast significantly. The number one is the countries who have agency. In a world where trade works, you have to have a semi-militarized system to ensure that civilian traffic on the seas can go wherever it wants to, whenever it wants to. And if the United States decides to use its agency to protect this system, regardless of what it thinks about getting in return, then the United States can inject life into this system to a degree. We can't do it on a global basis. We no longer have the naval forces for that. But we could choose to stabilize 1 or 2 regions. And we would have to choose. Is it going to be Western Europe? Is it going to be East Asia? Is it going to be South Asia? Is it going to be the Middle East? We're going to have to pick. And based on who we choose, that will deflect the future for that region. And that in turn may have second-order effects that benefit some other regions. So, watch the Americans. If we decide not to go as populist and nationalist as we seem to be on both sides of the aisle, that matters a great deal. And then the second is if you change the rules of the game on me, if you change the technologies in play, I fully reserve the right to change my mind. So, for example, right now, the green transition can't happen. The materials that we need to do it don't exist. We have never doubled the output of any raw material that was already in use in a decade period ever in human history. And within the next 10 years, we need 3 times as much copper and 10 times as much nickel and 18 times as much graphite and on and on and on. It's 20 different materials that we need to more than double in 10 years. It can't happen. It won't happen unless the technology changes. If we figure out an inexpensive room temperature superconductor and a better battery chemistry tomorrow, well, then I have to do a lot of reevaluating. And if you change the map of energy so it's not dependent upon freedom of the seas, it's something easy to do, well, that changes a lot of the geopolitics that drive this world and changes a lot of the restrictions that I think right now are going to be crippling otherwise.
But it doesn't change any of the demography.
It doesn't change the demography. For demography, we would need a different sort of technological advance. I say this a little tongue-in-cheek, but only a little. We need Star Wars-style cloning where you can grow a full adult in 3 years and they have a full skill set. Just skip over the child's part. Because if we double the birth rate in most countries right now, you don't get your 25-year-olds who are skilled labor for 25 years. That's not soon enough. We'll be well past the collapse by then. So you have to shorten the time frame. So whether it's robotics and artificial intelligence being a new race or mass cloning, those are the only ways that I can see to get around the demographic problem. And clearly, we're light years away from those potential, air quote, solutions.
What is the sane immigration policy that we should want or should want to want? And what are the prospects of actually having a defensible southern border and northern border for that matter, wherein we actually know who's coming into the country and we can let in who we actually want in?
Yeah, the trick is to have an immigration system that incentivizes cooperation with authorities as opposed to penalizes it. Under the Trump administration, we basically blocked all routes to legal migration, leaving only illegal migration as an option to get in. And that overwhelmed the system and made it impossible to cope with the influx. And before you condemn Trump for that, keep in mind that the Biden administration has not changed a damn thing in that regard. Illegal migration remains basically blocked completely. What we need is a root and branch overhaul of the immigration system as a whole, which we have not done since the late 1980s. So there's a lot of things that would need to change. If you're looking for the policy that we've adopted in the last century that I thought was most promising, you have to go back to, among all presidents, the Carter administration. A couple of major hurricanes hit Central America, and these people's homes, livelihoods, and sources of food disappeared overnight. And so they started walking north. And there was no way to get them to stay because there was nothing for them to stay for. So what Carter did is he dispatched the Department of Immigration down to Central America and issued 3-year work permits to everyone who wanted one. And as long as for those 3 years you paid your taxes and kept your nose clean and kept out of trouble, at the end of 3 years, you could either get a ticket home, courtesy of the U.S. government. You could apply for a 1-year extension, and there was a fee, or you could start the possibility of achieving citizenship. And it worked beautifully. And so, of course, we've never done it since. In terms of getting a different policy right now, I think that's impossible. We're going through a political transition right now where both the Republicans and the Democrats are redefining what they are. And the faction that is most in play right now doesn't know which side it's going to fall on is organized labor. And the issue that they are most opposed to is immigration reform or migration at all. So no one in the Republican or Democratic Party wants to even talk about a meaningful reform of the system until such time as they know which side organized labor is going to fall on. And I doubt we're going to get that this year or even next year. We'll get it this decade, and I hope kind of forward positioned in the decade from this point, but I don't think it's in the immediate future and certainly not before the federal elections. In the meantime—
How much immigration would we actually want given our demographic trends?
Well, that absolutely needs to be part of the conversation. But historically speaking, we've taken about 1.5 million to 2 million people a year every year. And that is something that from a cultural point of view, we have shown ourselves perfectly capable of absorbing. What's going to be different in the future versus the past, though, is that the makeup of that population is going to evolve quite a bit. Because of NAFTA, because of Mexico's late coming into the industrialized family of nations, it has been industrializing and urbanizing since 1990 on a pace that's much more rapid than what happened in Europe, say, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And that means that the birth rate in Mexico has plummeted. And it's gotten to the point that starting about 15 years ago, net migration from Mexico to the United States went flat. So for the better part of 50 years, the immigration story was a Mexico story. In the last 15 years, it's changed from a Mexico story to a Central American story. But there was also a free trade agreement with the Central Americans that it was implemented in the early 2000s called CAFTA, which means that the birth rate in Central America has also been plummeting. So by the end of this decade, the Central Americans will follow the Mexicans' footpath and not have enough young people to send north. So if we don't get meaningful immigration reform, the next phase of our immigration inflows is, well, we already know what it looks like. It's started, but it's going to become much more intense. It's not going to be our southern neighbors walking north. It's going to be people in distress or people who are fleeing from all over the world, just entering through the southern border because it's more porous. We haven't yet begun to process what that means for us culturally, because the Hispanic influx, the Mexican influx, has changed America, but it's changed in a way and at a speed and with a single point of input that I think we've all been able to manage more or less. And I think one of the great things that Donald Trump did do was convince most of the people in his political camp that the Mexicans are part of the family now. That was significant. I did not see that coming. But what happens when it's Indians and Chinese and Rwandans and Angolans? Because that's the direction we're moving. It's a much more complicated picture culturally, politically, from a law enforcement point of view. It's not an issue of just sending people back across the border if you decide you want to close it because they're not from there. And again, we need to have that conversation before we get to that point.
Do you think it's actually practically impossible to have a border that is impervious to illegal immigration?
Oh, it absolutely is. One of the things we discovered under the Trump administration is if you try to build a wall, the first thing you have to do is build construction roads across the Chihuahuan and Sonoran deserts to reach the border. And what you have done by building those roads is obviate half of the greatest natural barrier in the continent, an unpatrolled an unpatrolled border is much more secure at keeping out illegal migrants than one that is fortified, because to fortify it, you have to build the infrastructure that allows the people to cross. It's a little ass backwards, but it holds. Donald Trump will go down in his history as the most pro-illegal migrant president we've ever had.
And that will not be among his chief flaws, as it turns out. Speaking of
that feels like a trap. I'm going to go with a no comment on that one.
Well, I'm going to drag you into the morass with me, because the next question is about the 2024 presidential election. Why don't you think Trump can win?
Okay, so there's two big reasons that have basically condemned Trump to lead the Republicans into what is going to be the second or third greatest electoral defeat in American history. The first one has to do with the nature of the Republican alliance. The reason the Republicans have historically done well at the ballot box, especially in presidential campaigns, is their coalition doesn't fight. So you've got your social conservatives who don't care about military policy. You've got your military voters who don't care about fiscal policy. You have your fiscal policy voters who don't care about national defense, and on and on and on. You've got a relatively tight coalition with only a few factions. No one gets pissed off when another faction gets their way, and everyone shows up to vote. It's reliable. Maybe small, but it's reliable. The Democrats are kind of a mess. You've got your coastal elites, you have your organized labor, and you've got your various minorities, and they fight all the time about everything. They have different opinions on what civil rights even means. I mean, you talk to gays and blacks, you get different answers. You want to talk industrial policy, you talk to Greens and unions, you get different answers. So it's hard for them to win at the federal level, because anyone who tries to run on the issues and in energizing one faction, they piss off another one, and not everyone shows up to vote. Okay. What has happened under Trump is he started that Democratic-style internecine warfare on the Republican side. And so we're not going to get everyone to show up in the first place. So just on the merits, Republicans will defeat Trump just by not showing up. Second problem, independents. People have forgotten what went down in the midterms. We've only had two examples before last year before last, I guess now, in American history, where the party that was not in control of the presidency did so badly in the midterm. And that's because Donald Trump spent 2 years telling the world that the general elections in the United States doesn't matter. It should all be decided at the primary level, where he dominates. Well, for an independent voter, the general election is the only place that you matter. And so the general response was hold my beer. And they voted massively against any candidate that Donald Trump personally endorsed. For the Republicans to win in a typical year, they not only need to hold their coalition together, but because it's a smaller coalition, they need to get at least a majority, preferably 2/3, of independent voters. They can't do that anymore. Not only is their own coalition breaking, but independents are strongly voting against anything that touches Trump. And a 2-to-1 swing against them, like what we saw in the midterms, is a far more likely outcome for 2024 than anything else. That tells me, just looking at the numbers, that Trump is probably going to carry 10 or 12 states, none of them big, none of them including Florida or Texas. And it's just a question of how long the coattails are from those decisions. I have no idea about the coattails. Americans are very finicky on that.
Why wouldn't the current political polling be tracking this? I mean, if you're polling likely voters, and presumably independents are also included in those polls, so is it just that you're assuming that the people who imagine that they're likely voters aren't in fact likely voters?
Well, we have a data problem and a definition problem. The data problem is that true independent voters don't do polls, and certainly not a year out. Second, there's a definition problem. You've got roughly, let's call it 25 to 30% of the population that's hard Democrat and hard Republican. They're not going to be swayed. You've got another 15 to 20% that says they're on each side, that says they're independents, but really they vote for the Republicans or the Democrats over 90% of the time. So they're not really independents. The 10% in the middle, those are the ones that matter. Those are the ones who decide elections, and they never answer polls.
You mean these are the kind of people who just hang up when the pollster calls?
Yeah, exactly. And they don't even start thinking about politics in a meaningful way, oftentimes until they're driving to the voting booth.
All right. Well, this is one of your predictions, which has the merit of being confirmable
very
or disconfirmable.
Easy to vote up or vote no very, very soon. Yes.
7.5 months, we will know, or thereabouts.
Now, this all, of course, assumes that Biden doesn't die and Trump's not in jail, which are, of course, non-zero risks.
Right. What would you expect to happen if Biden died or was otherwise unfit or less fit than he is?
If Biden dies after the Democratic convention, then it's Kamala Harris. And in a Harris versus Trump fight, I think Trump would probably prevail. If Trump goes to prison before the Republican convention, then the Republicans have an opportunity to pick someone else, anyone else. And any other Republican would probably wipe the floor with Joe Biden. So timing of the conviction and timing of the death would really matter. And if we're going to talk about Joe Biden dying, we have to talk about Donald Trump dying because, they're only we're born like an hour and a half apart.
Or really, what was it, 4 years apart?
Yeah, if Trump were to become our next president, he would be the oldest president ever to take office, just like Joe Biden would be.
Right. All right. Well, so given this litany of fairly grim prognostications, what is your level of? You don't strike me as a gloomy guy. You don't strike me as a lunatic prepper who's spending all your time hedging your bet against the future. What is it like to be you, given that these are the kinds of thoughts you spend a lot of your time, all of your professional time thinking?
I actually feel pretty good. The globalized period was a period in history. It was never going to last forever. And now we're in an interregnum between this and whatever comes next. And whatever comes next is going to involve the United States in a very good position. So we're going through the changes right now, and that's awkward, and that's painful, and that's part of our political process too. But we've gotten through it before. As to the American political phases, I think, unfortunately, that we're going to go into a much more isolationist retrenchment position, regardless of what happens with our presidential politics. I think that is a fairly strong belief on both the left and the right now. And even if there was another popular option right now, I don't think we'd be able to really discuss it until the Democrats and the Republicans reform as whatever they're going to be next. But I have confidence there that we'll get there because this is not the first time that our political system is broken down and reformed. It is the sixth. It's just that.
Why do you say unfortunately, given that?
Well, I would like for us to go back to 1992 and have that conversation about the sort of world we want to see. I would love to have that conversation, open, honest, direct, and forward-looking. But that's not going to happen.
Aren't you saying, I mean, isn't the picture grim enough demographically that it's not a burden that the U.S. can truly lift? I mean, that whatever contribution we make to the global welfare on your account is going to be on some level at our own disadvantage?
Oh, sure. I mean, part of what makes me sad is that this political transition is happening at a time where American decisions are going to shape the human condition for the remainder of the century, and we're incapable of having a conversation about what those decisions should be. Mm-hmm. So at the point where, and this is more or less the story of the last 30 years, going through this transition in the post-Cold War environment, this had been the time for leadership, and we haven't had any. And this is kind of the last chance to tilt the world in whatever direction we think would be better. And we're not going to have it this year or next year. I mean, hopefully we'll finish our own internal transition before the next presidential election. But by that point, there's really not a lot that could be done for the Chinas and the Italys and the Germanys and the Koreas of the world.
Well, Peter, it's always interesting. Thank you for the time you've taken here. And I'm looking forward to seeing how the conversation with you evolves.